Welcome to the Human Athlete Podcast, empowering your life transition beyond sport, while celebrating the whole person behind the athlete. With your hosts, Kelsey Stockard, Steve Moore, and Jaime Comer, powered by Athlete Career Transition. Hi, I'm Jaime Comer. I'm the Chief Transition Guide at Athlete Career Transition, an Olympic medalist and a human athlete. In this episode, we have the amazing Dr. Daya Grant. She's a mental performance consultant for athletes, and she blends her neuroscience background with the mind and body practices of meditation, mindfulness, yoga, and more. Daya believes in training your mind like you train your body. Dedicating time towards your inner game. And you're going to hear that theme through our conversation about really exploring what our body is telling us, how to listen in, the power of stillness. And we start by exploring what neuroscience is. And as you'll see, Daya is so amazing at being able to make this type of science information that is actually relevant and digestible and understandable for us all. And she helps us also explore really how to get out of our own way, improving our mental game so we can improve our whole game, right? And you'll hear also about really what's unique about the brain of the high level athlete. What makes us unique, and how can we use those skills that we've gained and honed actually in our sport and in transition. I love that theme throughout the conversation too, is the work that Daya is doing with athletes, current athletes, is helping them prepare and transition moving forward. And wherever you are in your transition, fully retired, listening in, working with athletes, she shares these tools and insights that we can all use for ourselves, for our inner game, and then for us moving forward through transition or again, wherever we may be. Fantastic stuff. We also touch on the impact of concussions and really how long do concussions last? What do we look for? How do they impact us during transition? Being from water polo, being a goalkeeper and being hit in the head many times from a water polo ball and having concussions, I was particularly curious about this topic and how that impacts us moving forward when we do retire, when we do move on from our sport. And we also wrap up with some delicious wisdom from Daya for every human athlete. Definitely listen in to the end. It's just this beautiful, I almost think of it like just these words of wisdom and a pep talk that I could just play every day and listen to. So thank you, Daya, for joining us, for being here, and thank you for listening. Thank you so much, Daya, for being here today with us on the Human Athlete Podcast.
Thank you, Jaime, for having me. I'm so pumped to be here.
Yeah. How's your energy today?
Good. Now that I've worked out some of these tech kinks that tend to creep up, my energy's good. I'm thrilled to be here, and I'm always excited to talk to you.
Me too. This is just a wonderful opportunity to have this conversation, and I'm so excited for all that is going to come up through this conversation for the athletes, for everybody listening. Every time I've spoken with you, I just receive so many dollops of golden nuggets. So this is such a joy. And let's get some context here for everybody listening. What is it that you do? How would you describe that?
Sure. That's a hard question sometimes.
Right?
Because
let's start big.
Let's start big. Who am I? What do I do?
That's the next one, yeah.
On paper,
Yeah.
on paper and in my day-to-day, I am a certified mental performance consultant. So I work with athletes, helping them get out of their own way and strive towards elevated levels of performance. I also integrate my background in neuroscience. I have a PhD in neuroscience, as well as my love and passion for yoga. I'm a yoga teacher as well. And all of that informs my work with athletes.
What a beautiful trifecta. And how would you describe neuroscience for us who are new to it?
Good. Yes, absolutely. So a neuroscientist is anyone who studies the human nervous system, and that includes the brain, the spinal cord, and really how the nervous system, this beautiful system that we have, impacts our behavior and our ability to think. So essentially, we study the biological basis of behavior. And I think it's important to point out the difference between neuroscientists and neurologists, because a lot of times there is confusion about what the difference is. And while we all study and are excited about the brain, neurologists, their training is different. So, neurologists are medical doctors, they have an MD, and they work directly with patients. Whereas neuroscientists have a PhD, they work closely with neurologists, depending on what they're studying, but they are much more focused on the research side of things. And I think an easy way to understand this is when I did my PhD program, I studied concussions. That was my focus. The first 2 years, I learned everything I could about the brain in general, big picture, anatomy, function. And then I started to hone my focus and really narrow in on that question of what happens when you get repeat concussions and does that affect neurodegenerative disease later on. So my advisor was a neuroscientist. She was a PhD neuroscientist, but we worked closely with another mentor of mine who was a neurologist, and he was the one seeing athletes and other humans in clinic who had had concussions. So there was a lot of overlap, and the work that he was doing in the clinic informed what we were doing in the lab, and vice versa. Um, so now I take that knowledge of the brain and apply it to my work with athletes. I do work with some athletes that have had concussions, and it's always helpful for them to talk to someone who has knowledge in that area. But I also just apply the general understanding of the brain to athletes who obviously we need to use our brain to do what we do and to do it well.
Yeah, we do. We sure do. And we'll definitely be getting into those concussion questions. That's something that I'm particularly curious about and for our community as well. What led you on this path to neuroscience and to yoga and athletes?
So I was a dancer, a serious dancer growing up, and I always appreciated movement. I loved moving myself, but I really had no idea, and I never really contemplated the involvement of the brain in what it was that I was doing until I started thinking about what I'm going to study in college. And my dad is a medical doctor. He also has a PhD in biochemistry. And I loved that he was able to apply the scientific knowledge that he gained through his doctoral program to his day to day work, actually helping people and patients in a very real time way. So I was thinking, okay, I want to do something in medicine, in science. It's fascinating. And I was introduced to neuroscience right before I started college. I ended up deciding to major in neuroscience. And early on, I thought, well, the logical thing is to go to medical school and maybe go into neurosurgery. And then I thought about what that would actually mean in terms of number of years. And I felt like
Mm-hmm.
maybe that's not what I want to do.
Yeah.
And thanks to the encouragement from my parents, they said, you can take your knowledge of neuroscience and apply it in a different way. You don't necessarily have to do neurosurgery, which is incredibly challenging and competitive and may not be what you want to do. And so I thought about that as I was developing my thesis in college, and I landed on writing a grant proposal studying um, the effect of pre-competition anxiety on basketball performance.
Wow.
I was a dancer, but I grew up in a basketball loving house. My brother played, and I thought, well, that's a really cool question. As I was doing the research for that, I was introduced to this whole field of sports psychology, and I thought that's what I want to do. This is so cool. It's combining the brain and my love for the mind and the brain with sport. So I went to my master's program to study sports psychology, and toward the end of that, the concussion epidemic was really starting to gain traction and it was in
Mm-hmm.
mainstream media. And I
Mm-hmm.
thought, okay, I love sports psychology, but I want to do more neuroscience again. So I just listened to that little voice that said, go study that for a while. So then did my
Yeah.
PhD in neuroscience, focused on that question. And long story short, at the end of all of that, I really missed working with athletes again. So I launched my private practice and I combined all of this stuff and I said I think there's a real interest from athletes in better understanding what's going on in their brain, and I can speak that language but also translate it for the vast majority of people that don't study the brain for 5 years and want to know how we can harness it, how we can actually use our mind to our advantage without um, having to study it for 5 years. So that's sort of how I've combined it all, and it's just such a joy to see people light up when they realize that they are the masters of their own mind and they can take control over this thing that we walk around with on top of our body.
Yes, we can. And I'm also hearing that you're able to help people translate that experience. You know, like you said, all the information that you've gained and learnings and experiences you've had, you translate that in a way that is accessible, it's relevant, it's understandable for people, particularly for athletes. I'm hearing to be able to use that in, as you said before, that phrase, real time as well. That
Yes.
and being able to actually have practical tools and move forward and have um, and I'm seeing also this combination with that yoga piece. You know, where did yoga come into your life and then into your practice?
Yeah, so as that young dancer, my mom told me for many, many years that I should probably do yoga. It would really help with flexibility, which was an area that was a challenge for me. And like any good young athlete, I said thanks, but no thanks. I'm doing what I'm doing, and this seems to be working. And then, of course, I went to college, took my first yoga class, left the class feeling like I could take on the world. At the very least, I can do this paper that I have due on Monday. And I just had this sense of empowerment that I hadn't necessarily tapped into so easily before. And that was it. That was the hook. I I was raised in a family that meditated, and my brother and I were lucky enough to have parents who taught us how to meditate when we were really, really little. And I realized that, oh my gosh, I have that background. Now here's the movement piece of yoga, the hatha yoga piece. And both of these things really benefit me, and I feel better when I do it. So it was a practice that I cultivated for myself for a long time and ultimately decided to do teacher training at the time, not so that I could teach, but so that I could deepen my own practice.
Mm-hmm.
But then as things unfolded, I realized that I actually do love to teach because again, I love working with people and helping people in real time to tap into their own greatness. And I was able to do that through yoga. And now a lot of the yoga philosophy informs my work with athletes. So I start every single session with meditation, a guided breath work, very simple, just getting the athlete centered so that we can really dive in and get to work. And really in the past 5 or so years, meditation, mindfulness in particular, and some of these aspects of yoga philosophy and Eastern contemplative traditions have seeped into the sport world, and we've seen it. We've seen
Mm-hmm.
athletes talk about how they're incorporating this into their training, into their daily life. Um, and now it's so awesome to work with athletes who are saying, I did that guided meditation you've been giving me, and it's actually working. I'm seeing a difference, and I'm taking to the field, and I'm so much more centered, and I'm able to filter out distractions. And so it's sort of this experiment that we're engaged in, where I understand the science of it, and I've practiced it myself, and now I'm able to share that with athletes, and we're really able to tailor it for them, and they can extract as much meaning as they can from it. So it's I'm just so grateful that I was introduced to it young, and now there's some really awesome science to back up this ancient wisdom.
And I'm also hearing that this combination, that's what you're offering as well, and just naturally infusing in your life and your practice is combination of that science, of that, tapping into your inner wisdom, your inner strength, and being a master of your mind, so to speak. You shared some of the benefits already of practicing mindfulness and yoga and these kind of guided meditations and whatnot. What else are you finding in your work with the athletes? What comes up in terms of what what they're receiving, how they respond to it?
They're responding so positively. And a lot of the athletes don't necessarily know what they're looking for when they come to work for me, with me. It's this general desire to
Mm-hmm.
increase their awareness around what's going on in their mind and
Yeah.
figure out how to get out of their own way. And what meditation does is it allows them to tap into that stillness within them that they know is there, but it's often clouded by thoughts and
Mm-hmm.
these thought patterns and ruminative thoughts and the stories we tell ourselves and past traumas and all of this stuff. And so
Yeah.
it's really hard to get past that, get beneath the chatter to this place of trust. And so many athletes are saying, I know I can do this. Like I do this in practice, or I've done it before. Why is it that I'm not always consistent? Or why is it that I'm having trouble with this skill? Or I get out onto the field on game day and everything just feels like it's closing in on me. I
Mm-hmm.
know I can do this. So what's getting in the way? And when we come back to basics and I help them connect to their breath, to the stillness that's underneath all of that chatter, then they're able to connect to this place of confidence and trust and participate in their sport and perform from that place. And that's a much more powerful place to be than up in your head all the time, just going through thoughts after thoughts after thoughts. That can get really, really exhausting. So it's really incredible. It's powerful. Every single athlete has a different relationship with meditation or with breath work, and
Mm-hmm.
it's been such a joy for me to witness how it's serving so many athletes across the spectrum.
Wow. And Daya, I'm also hearing that in the work you're doing with current athletes, from this perspective of transition, I'm seeing you providing the tools and also kind of the space for people to tap into again their inner kind of their centered self more often. So when they do transition, when they do retire from their sport, when that does happen, whatever the circumstances are, they're going to be able to navigate that with more clarity or with more, again, more centeredness through that experience, I imagine. And that leads us to looking at this, kind of looking at the athlete's brain. Let's go there a little bit to get context to what we're working with too inside the athlete brain. For current athletes, and then so we can kind of apply this looking at transitioning athletes and beyond. What is unique, or how does the athlete brain work? Like, what's going on in there?
Oh my gosh, it's such a fascinating question. And it's a huge question because that's just like asking, well, how does the brain work, right? It's complex.
Do we have time for that? No,
But
no.
yeah, I think we could cover it in 45 minutes, I'm sure.
Yeah.
Um, but it's such a good question, and I think it helps to break it down into pieces. So let's consider different categories of brain activity. And these are just things that we'll use as an example. So the high level athlete has developed all these processes, all these brain processes over time, over learning through their experiences. And when we look at the research, and there's been some pretty cool neuroscience research that's come out in the past 10, maybe 20 years, that compares high level athletes with novices. And one of the areas in which this is really applied is in motor learning. So, any high level athlete has this incredible ability to control motor function, right? You have to know how to move your body in a very specific, precise way to get to achieve the goal you are after.
Hmm.
Um, there's it's really incredible how athletes do this, and you would think that, or I used to think, that their brain must be really involved. Like there must be a lot of activity happening in order to control such a precise movement. And in fact,
Yeah.
the opposite is true. So there actually is, if you look at fMRI, functional magnetic resonance imaging studies, you can see that the areas of the brain that are involved in motor function are much smaller. There's a much narrower area of activation in high level athletes, elite athletes versus novice athletes. So, as you're young and you're learning a new skill, I mean, we can think about if we're parents and you have children, or if you've coached young athletes, there is a lot going on in their brain. They're trying to figure out what do I need to do, what's important, what's not, how do I
Hmm.
filter out irrelevant information and focus on the salient stuff. But as they start to work the process and develop their motor control and motor function, there's a pruning that happens. And so ultimately, their brain only needs to work and activate in a certain way to achieve the same result. The brain becomes much more efficient. So that's just one example of how
Yeah.
the high level athlete brain is different. There was a recent study last year that came out looking at auditory processing. So how Division One athletes are able to process sound compared to just the average person. And it's, again, they're able to filter out irrelevant noises and focus on the one sound that they're told to focus on. And we don't know exactly what the implications for that are yet, but essentially the brain is just much better able at focusing on what's important and eliminating the rest. So, how then does that apply to transition, perhaps? I don't know if that's your next question, but it's definitely
Hmm.
something that is interesting to think about if we want to go there, or we can detour first.
Yeah, and I'm also observing, Daya, as you're sharing that the similarities or the synergy between how high level athletes can hone in or simplify what's going on and really be efficient with their brain or with their sound, with their hearing. And that makes me think of what you were describing before about the mindfulness and meditation and navigating all our thoughts and all the wild thoughts going on in our head. I'm really curious about if the high level athlete is able to hone in and really kind of, if they choose to really bring in that mindfulness practice, really excel in that area, then to be able to simplify the thoughts going on in their head, so to speak.
Yes, that's absolutely true. I think that is a leg up that elite athletes, high level athletes already have, just as you described. And so that doesn't mean that meditation would be easy. I mean, it's not, because we're
Yeah.
humans. We're humans, and our brains are designed to have 70,000 thoughts a day, and we're supposed to predict the future and learn from the past, and that requires a lot of activity. But we are also able to activate it in a much more streamlined way, and athletes have already trained their brain to be able to do that. So in essence, that should it, the learning curve may be a lot and not as steep for elite
Ah.
athletes.
Mm-hmm.
There's also some other factors to consider. I think there's so much of what we do as mental performance consultants is help athletes cultivate mental skills. So, resilience, ability to focus, ability to deal with stress, and goal setting, and all these things. But movement in and of itself, especially high level movement, cultivates those things already without us really having to do a whole lot of extra work. So, again, um, you're starting from an elevated place. You're starting like 5 steps ahead, just by being a high level athlete and having developed your brain to deal with adverse conditions and to deal with challenges. Um, so it's exciting to think about, okay, how can I take all of these skills that I've
Mhm.
already developed, whether I recognize it or not, and now apply it to my life outside of sport?
Yes, that transition beyond. And I'm wondering too, what, as we talk about here on the Human Athlete podcast, really normalizing that conversation around retirement and actually bringing more resources and light to that, to what's happening there. And what needs to happen for us during transition to be able to have a space or place or knowledge or resources or someone like yourself helping us, you know, through that experience of, okay, well, what do I do with my brain? How do I use all that stuff I just gained? Do I have skills from sport that I can apply now? How many of us know that, right?
Right. I think unless you have had exposure to any of these topics in the past and know the terminology, then you're not really sure, and it can feel very overwhelming. So I think the first place to start is to recognize that as an athlete, you've already gone through a tremendous amount of change. As an athlete who got to this high level of performance, you had a lot of inflection points in your life that you got through, and there were many opportunities for you to have left your sport. Um, you don't get through an athletic career without injuries, without challenges, without being forced into the next level, maybe before you totally feel ready. There are all of those changes that have already occurred. So I think it's important to just reflect and recognize that, oh, okay, I've gone through changes before. I can do it again. Yes, this is a
Mm.
huge one, but
Mm-hmm.
I can do it. And it's helpful to again think about the brain and how it's developed. We when we're young, first few years of life, we have so many synaptic connections. Like our neurons are just connected to every other neuron, and it's like this really, really full tree that has not been trimmed ever. And then as we experience things as a kid, as we start to be exposed to external stimuli and engage in behaviors repeatedly, our brain prunes and the connections. I mean, there's this phrase that we use a lot in neuroscience: use it or lose it. If you don't use some of these pathways, then you're going to lose them and you'll strengthen the pathways that you do use. So there's this pruning that takes place. That doesn't mean that then, as you're in your 20s, 30s, 40s, you're hardwired, because we know that the brain is able to adapt and change, but it's not doing so at the degree that it did when you're 2, 3, 4, 5 years old. So change as we age becomes harder and harder and harder. And we can appreciate that from the neuroscience standpoint. And that helps us because, okay, all right, this is tough. Like, let's acknowledge that this huge change is going to be really tough and it's going to be stressful. Let's also recognize that there are tools for adapting to intense levels of stress, some of which you've you've had before. It may be practices in meditation or mindfulness. It may be your ability to work the process. Um, the best athletes are able to focus on the process, say 95% of the time, and only 5% of the time think about what's coming up and what's down the road. So, as an
Mm.
athlete's transitioning out of sport, they have some idea, maybe, of where they want to go, maybe, oftentimes, no idea. And that's okay.
Right.
What do you need to do today to support yourself where you are right now? Focus 90%, 95% of your attention there on the process, on the moment, and then do what you did as an athlete. Trust that you're going to figure it out. Trust that things are going to unfold in a way that is most supportive for you. And also trust that everything that has happened to you and will happen is happening for you and for your own growth and your development. And if you can look at this change from that growth mindset perspective of, this is challenging and also it's going to force me to grow, then that's a really good place to be. And if you need help with any of that, which I would expect most everyone would, then you
Yeah.
reach out and do not hesitate to reach out and do not think that you're the only one that's ever gone through this, because every single athlete at some point in their career, maybe earlier than they wanted to or maybe much later, goes through this transition. And there are people like certified mental performance consultants, like therapists or psychologists, if there are some depressive things that come up, that can support you on that journey.
Wow, Daya. I mean, you speaking about the journey and the process, and also you really honed in on one of the most common challenges I'm finding. As we go through transition, that unknown phase. There's this concept around transition phases of there's like the end phase, the neutral phase, where you don't really kind of know what's happening. There's a lot of unknowns, and then the new beginnings phase. And oftentimes, within the work that I do with the athletes, it's we kind of meet at that end phase. Okay, I'm finishing my sport, and now in this neutral phase of I don't really know what I'm doing. I know what I'm doing a little bit, but there's a lot of big questions right now. And you just brought in that tool for athletes of remembering, oh, okay, trust. I can trust that 95%. I can focus on that process. That's what I did before. And you also focused on, or actually, I'm curious about actually around the tree piece. As you said, we're pruning, right? The tree as we're getting older, and that's another big theme around transition is around this. We put all our eggs in one basket, so to speak, right? For as athletes often, and all we do is focus on our sport. Do you think there's an opportunity if while you're competing and training to still kind of broaden your horizons and focus in other areas of your life to bring you joy or whatever else it is to give you a sense of fulfillment? Would that help that tree stay kind of a little more full? Does that benefit us moving forward, you think?
That's such a good question. I think theoretically, yes. Theoretically, pay attention to the things that light you up outside of your sport and do more of that. Now, when I say do more of that, I completely recognize that you don't have a lot of time to do anything else. When you're in it and
Yeah.
you are competing at a high level, you are you're all in. And I it's it's so tricky because I don't want to ever tell an athlete, don't be all in. You have to be all in. That's the nature of it. And also, is there a way for you to recognize that there's something bigger and there is something beyond your sport? And you are more than an athlete. You are an athlete and you're also these other things. So I think let's use that 95.5% idea and split again. So 95% of the time, yes, you're still in your sport, you're focused on what you need to be doing. But 5% of your time, can you connect to something that lights you up outside of it? Or can you connect to
Mm.
something in sport even that you can pursue more outside of sport? Do you really love I mean, there's a reason why so many athletes do go into coaching or commentating or something that still involves them being in their sport, but it just their relationship with the sport changes some. Do you want to speak about your experience? Does that light you up? Do you love when you get in conversations with people about why you do what you do? Well, you can still do that. It won't be exactly the same, but pay attention to that. So I think so much of it is paying attention to what really fuels you. And I guarantee there are things that fuel you outside of your sport, or perhaps within sport, but without you being the athlete performing that sport. It's a challenge, but yes, the more that we can exercise that while we're still playing, the easier the transition may be. And then also those tools of connecting to who you are as a person. I've worked with athletes who um, came to me thinking that their sport is everything and they don't know what they'll do when they have to give it up or they're forced to give it up
Mm-hmm.
or they age out, which is where most athletes are. And then as you know the years go on, and some athletes I've worked with for 2, 3, 4 years, they're starting to broaden their perspective a little bit. And it doesn't mean that they're taking anything away from their participation in their sport, but they're seeing that, oh, okay, for a long time I've been sort of in this box looking out through this tiny little sliver at the universe outside of my sport.
Yeah.
And now I'm starting to peel back that curtain a little bit and realize, oh, I have more to offer. Yes, I'm an athlete and also I'm an amazing human. And let's tap into that and explore that a little bit. And that curiosity is so exciting for me to see.
Oh, yeah. You can be both. You can be human and an athlete. Yeah.
Yes, which
Wow.
is why I love this podcast so much.
Yeah. Wow. Okay. So when we're thinking about, switching gears here to concussions, I know we could talk ages about this piece. Switching gears for a moment about concussions, what are you finding? You've done so much research on this already, and how I'm really curious about how this might impact athletes down the road when they transition to what's kind of to look for, how to kind of care for themselves. Thankfully, the conversation around concussions has been increasing, but to continue that increase of discussion here, let's how do you suggest moving forward with concussions in the first place?
Yeah, it's challenging because as we know, every concussion's unique and the way it manifests is very different from person to person to person. So one athlete may have had a single concussion and is still dealing with consequences from that concussion. Um, Other athletes in high impact sports like football, like hockey, like soccer, they water polo,
Yeah.
they may have had they may have had a series of concussions and be doing okay and not feeling like it's impacting their daily life. So there's really a range here. And it is important to recognize that there is a much greater understanding and a greater tolerance around concussion and people who have experienced it. It doesn't have the stigma as it once had. It's still really challenging to be an athlete who's had a concussion and is still perhaps dealing with some of the ramifications from it because ultimately it is an invisible injury. No one can tell based on looking at you that you're dealing with some brain fog or headaches or getting overstimulated easily. There are a range of symptoms that someone who's had a concussion or multiple concussions may experience. So, moving forward as you transition out of sport, um, it's really being aware of how concussion symptoms manifest for you and continuing to take care of yourself and advocating for yourself and recognizing when you need downtime, when you need to slow down and not be engaged in so many external stimuli all the time. We're bombarded constantly with information, right? That's just the age we're living in. And as you're recovering from a concussion, and it may be a long, long, long process, dealing with information overload is a very real thing. And it can then manifest in really displeasant ways of being sensitive to light and to too much sound and having a hard time quieting the brain when you're trying to go to sleep. Acknowledge those things and seek help. I personally am a huge fan of yoga, obviously, and meditation for concussion management. And this is something that you absolutely can do, and it'll benefit not just the concussion, as we've discussed, but so many other areas of your mental well being after you transition out of your sport. So, there, I developed a program for yoga for concussion through yoga medicine, and I mean, it's a course designed for yoga teachers, but I have had and I've seen athletes take the course who are just curious about how can I use yoga to help deal with concussion. There are resources out there, so reach out to me, Google them. there are a lot more athletes talking about how they're managing their concussions after sport.
Yeah. And how long can the repercussions of a concussion exist?
Again, it totally depends. I mean, typically, a single concussion is going to resolve within days, maybe weeks, potentially months. The symptoms that tend to persist after a single concussion, the biggest one, the most common one, is headache. So post concussion headache is common and
Hmm.
can certainly be debilitating and affect your day to day. If you've experienced multiple concussions, it depends. It depends on how you were able to take care of yourself and recover after each of those concussions. So the research I did looked at repeat concussions, um, and then again long-term effects. But one thing, and the biggest finding, the biggest takeaway, is when those concussions occurred in close proximity to each other before the brain was able to fully recover and get back to baseline in between each concussion, then the effects were longer lasting. When there was enough time between those concussions for the brain to
Hmm.
heal, then it was almost as if the brain looked like it had just been dealt a single concussion as opposed to multiple concussions. So you may want to think back on your career. Were those concussions happening within weeks of each other, or were there months in between concussions or years? And if that's the case, you may not be dealing with any repercussions afterward. Um, it's it's so dependent on each person's beautiful, unique brain, and
Hmm.
a lot of times it can feel scary if you don't know, well, what can I expect a few years from now? Am I going to be dealing with some of these effects of my concussions forever, or are they going to start to dissipate? Um, the true answer is we don't know for sure, but we do know that when symptoms start to flare up, pay attention to them and respond accordingly and slow down, rest. Um, if your symptoms are exacerbated, your brain is stressed. So take notice. If you have an orthopedic injury, you're not going to push it. You may push it, but you know
Hmm.
that's not good for you. And it's the same
Yeah.
thing with your brain. If it's talking to you, then listen, and then seek help if you're really concerned and not sure what to do or what not to do.
Right. And having all everything you're sharing, Daya, I so appreciate you bringing more awareness to all those listening about what to look for in terms of that in your own body. And that I'm seeing also this theme through our conversation about pausing, listening to the body, like being aware of what the body's telling us. And being one who had multiple concussions in a row, definitely felt the experiences after that, the fog, and really had a tough time with it because I didn't know what to look for. I didn't really know what it was and didn't know how to really seek help for it. Having someone like yourself talk about this and having this conversation today, I know is going to be very impactful because the conversation is rising, but there's still opportunity to talk more about it. So thanks for bringing light to this right now in this moment too.
Yes, absolutely. I'm so glad that you asked that question because it's something that affects so many more people than we realize. And I have also been affected by concussion, um, and this was after 5 years of studying it, and it still freaked me out, and it really scared me. And so, if I was that scared, I can
Yeah.
imagine most other people who didn't
Hmm.
study it for 5 years. It's scary when your brain starts to do something and act in a way and be sensitive in a way that it wasn't before. But there are tools, and self-compassion is way up there and something that you need to practice.
Self-compassion, mindfulness, I'm meditation. There's so many wonderful tools that you've been sharing today. And I'm really curious, Daya, if you could wave a magic wand, what would you want every athlete to have available to them, current or retired?
Well, you just mentioned it. You mentioned those tools. I think a well-developed toolbox of mental skills. Um, and really, we we have to cultivate those skills. It's something we have to practice. Just like you as an athlete conditioned for years and years and years, conditioned your body to perform a certain way, we have to do the same with our mind. So you can't expect that all of a sudden, with the flip of a switch, you're going to be able to pull out some of these techniques and skills without having trained them and cultivated them. But there, there's so much science behind this, and we know how these things work, and we know how to practice them. And it's just working with someone to help you cultivate those things. And then also, I draw this from yoga philosophy and from Eastern contemplative traditions. But as cliche as it sounds, I truly believe that everything we need is within us. We just need to learn how to access it and cultivate it. So, for every single athlete listening, you have everything within you that you need. You just sort of have to do, consider Michelangelo and just peeling away layers of marble to reveal that beautiful human athlete within you, and your greatness, your light, whatever you want to call it, you have it. You have the ability to manage anything that's thrown your way in life. So know that, have that trust, cultivate it if you need more of it, and then you can move forward knowing that you've got the tools. You just have to sharpen them sometimes and remember to pull them out.
Yeah, remember that they're there. And oh, Daya, you are speaking to my heart right now. Just saying, like, doing that inner work and recognizing that everything you have is within you. I mean, that's such an empowering movement. And, I think when we're going through transition, through change, in any life change, and in particular athletes as they transition out of sport, because we're having so many questions, it's foggy around us. Maybe we don't have all the answers. There's a lot of lack of, loss of clarity there, and even, confusion around our identity and our self-worth, where it is. And that reminder that, oh yeah, wait a minute, I can pause for a moment and just pause and tune inward. Oh, okay, it's there. Okay, the answers are there. I can listen and see what's
Yes.
my heart is telling me, my soul is telling me, what my intuition, my gut, where it's guiding me. Wow.
Yes, absolutely. And I think sometimes it's hard to hear someone else say that you've got all the tools. You have it. I mean,
Yeah,
you may
I know.
hear that, but you're like, oh, but okay, you may be saying that in general, but I personally don't. But that's when I encourage the athlete to look back on their whole history, on their story, on their journey, and realize that they had tough moments. We've all had really challenging moments, and we've all gotten through them. So that kind of can help, that reflection, that looking back briefly to recognize that, oh, yeah, there's proof that I do have everything within me that I need. Because sometimes without that proof, it feels uncertain and overwhelming.
Yeah, yeah, and it feels a little like, okay, well, I just want the answers. Someone else give me the answers. It's a little easier that way. But I'm also hearing, Daya, you're offering space. You're helping people reflect, right? Recognize what they already have inside of them through their experiences that they've had to be able to use for future experiences. And if that's not the power of transition right there, like a magical tool right there, I don't know what it is. So that's
Yes.
beautiful what you're doing.
Oh my
Yeah.
goodness. Well, it's such an honor to work with such incredible humans that all have these really powerful journeys and very impressive journeys. So I honor what you do and what you're doing and how you're helping athletes navigate this really, really incredibly difficult period. It's beautiful and important, and you're doing it with such grace and from a place of experience. So thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. We're doing this together, all of us. That's for sure. We're all human athletes right here. We're all human. And even wrapping up, Daya, I have a feeling I might know this answer with what you shared earlier, but what do you want every athlete to know? What do you want every human athlete to know?
You are powerful beyond measure. You
Ooh.
had moments where you recognized your power and your strength and your fire. I know that that's what fueled you through your career. And none of that's lost. You still have that. So, whatever it is that you want to do, whether you know what it is yet or not, you'll do it. And you'll do it in a really magnificent way and in a way that you only you can do. So celebrate your uniqueness, celebrate your journey, your story, and trust that the next chapter is going to unfold in the most beautiful way that serves not only you, but people around you.
So beautiful. And we celebrate you, Daya. Thank you so much for being here today on the Human Athlete Podcast. We celebrate you.
Oh my goodness, this was such an honor. Thank you for this opportunity, Jamie. You're such a light, and I love this conversation.
Thank you. Ciao, friends. Thank you for joining us today on the Human Athlete Podcast. To learn more, we invite you to visit www.athletecareertransition.com. See you next time.